A young woman headed home after a 4th of July party, but she never made it there. From the very first hours of the investigation, detectives began uncovering a series of troubling and downright bizarre clues. But none of them could have imagined the kind of horror they were about to face. And when the full truth finally came out, this case would go down as one of the most chilling in California's history. Megan Barroso was born on March 15, 1981, in the American town of Camarillo, California. When she was just a little kid, her parents split up, and she ended up living with her mom. But her dad stayed in the picture, seeing her regularly. As a child, Megan got into dancing, and it quickly became her absolute passion. During her high school years, her mom lost her job at the local hospital, forcing them to pack up and move to this small town called Templeton, about 3 hours away. It hit Megan hard. She had to leave behind her school and all of her friends. Right after graduating, she decided to head back closer to home. She rented a little apartment in a place called Moore Park, enrolled in the local community college, and landed a job as an assistant in the purchasing department at a clothing manufacturing company. Down the line, Megan planned to transfer to a university, but she hadn't decided what she wanted to study yet. She was excited to be spending time with her friends again. On top of that, her dad had just gotten remarried and had a newborn son. So Megan made it a point to drop by whenever she could. On July 4, 2001, when she was 20, Megan had plans to spend the whole day with her friends. It was Independence Day, and fireworks were set to go off everywhere in celebration. She started by heading over to her friend Lindsay's house, where her family was throwing a barbecue. Everyone was having a great time, and as evening came, they got invited to a beach party in a nearby town. Megan left her car at Lindsay's place, and their friends came by to pick them up. The party itself was pretty chill. They hung out inside for a while, then headed down to the beach to watch the fireworks. A few hours later, they stopped by another friend's house, and around 2 a.m., they got dropped back off at Lindsay's. Lindsay offered to let Megan crash there for the night since the drive back to her place would take a while. But Megan turned it down because she had to be up early for work the next morning. As Megan leaned in to hug Lindsay goodbye, she accidentally knocked her purse and nearly everything spilled out onto the ground. They both crouched down to pick it all up, but in the mix, Megan accidentally grabbed Lindsay's phone. Neither of them noticed and Megan hit the road. Just a few minutes later, Lindsay realized her phone was missing and figured Megan must have grabbed it by accident. She called her own number from the house phone. Megan picked up, turned the car around, came back to drop it off, and then finally headed home for real. Around 4 a.m., a security guard was patrolling one of the streets in Moore Park, keeping an eye on the local business. At some point, he heard these popping sounds coming from a nearby street and figured someone was setting off fireworks over there. He headed that way, and soon enough, he spotted an abandoned car right in the middle of the road. The car was sitting partly on the median, engine still running, driver's door wide open. The headlights and wipers were both on, but there was no sign of the driver anywhere. At first, the security guard figured maybe some drunk partier from the holiday had crashed and just taken off. But then, he noticed a woman's flip-flop on the asphalt, and the other one was tucked under the driver's seat. That struck him as weird. Would a woman really ditch the scene of an accident without her shoes? He stepped closer, peered inside the car, and saw red stains everywhere. Realizing it was blood, he quickly stepped back and called the police. The officers started examining the car and spotted a few bullet holes. Most were riddled across the windshield, and the driver's side window was completely shattered. With all that blood inside the cabin, at least one of those bullets had to have hit the driver. But the cops immediately picked up on something weird. There wasn't a single drop of blood outside the car. If she'd gotten out on her own, blood would have definitely spilled onto the pavement. So, they figured the shooter might have grabbed the woman who was in there and taken her with them. On the left side of the car, the officers noticed some deep scratches, like another vehicle had sideswiped it. Right by the driver's seat was a purse, splattered with blood. There were no documents or ID inside, but tucked underneath the seat where the purse had been sitting, they found a cell phone also smeared with blood. While the forensics team combed through the car itself, the police scoured the area for any leads, and it didn't take long to find a few shell casings. Experts quickly determined they came from an AK-47 assault rifle. All of this painted a pretty grim picture for the police. According to the investigators, the woman behind the wheel had probably stopped at a traffic light when the perp pulled up next to her. He rammed her car, and she tried to speed away from him. But the guy pulled out an assault rifle and unloaded on her vehicle. It looked like one or more bullets hit her, causing her to lose control and veer onto the median. What happened next was still a total mystery, but the detectives figured the attacker might have grabbed her and hauled her off in his own car. They also realized her wounds probably weren't fatal, given the relatively small amount of blood in the cabin. While investigators were piecing everything together, the cops ran the plates and discovered the car was a rental. They contacted the company, and that's when they learned it had been rented by Megan. The detectives called around to every hospital in the area, but she hadn't shown up at any of them. That only made their theory about her being kidnapped even stronger. But they still had zero leads to point them in the right direction. There were no foreign fingerprints in the car, no surveillance cameras on the road, and at the time it all went down, not a single witness drove by. The detectives headed out to speak with Megan's friends and family. Everyone told them the same thing. They had no clue who could have wanted to hurt her. She wasn't the type to get into fights with anyone. She didn't have a boyfriend or any messy exes. And honestly, she'd never made any enemies in her life. The culps also spoke with Lindsay, who filled them in on everything that happened that day. According to her, she and Megan had a great time. Nothing weird or out of the ordinary happened at all. The only thing that really stuck out to her was this guy named John, whose house by the beach was hosting the party. Lindsay knew him, but it was Megan's first time meeting him. Throughout the night, John kept coming up to Lindsay, asking her to introduce him to Megan, but she kept shutting him down. She told him Megan wasn't the kind of girl who'd be into a quick fling, and that was exactly what John was after. The police questioned him, but the guy swore he never left the party, and everyone there backed him up, saying he was at the house until the early morning. So investigators crossed him off their list and shifted focus back to finding Megan. Police brought in search dogs to check the car, but they only followed her scent a few yards before stopping cold, as if it just disappeared right there. That only fueled detectives' theory that some unknown attacker had grabbed Megan, tossed her into his car, and taken off. Even with all that, police still launched a search around the area where the car was found. Officers hit the streets, combed through the nearby mountains, and checked along the banks of a small river. They even brought in helicopters with infrared sensors to scan from above, but none of it turned up a single lead. Meanwhile, the detectives discovered that Megan's car had this device, kind of like a black box, which logged everything that happened with the vehicle. The cops dove into that data and also brought in ballistic experts to map out the trajectories of all the bullets based on the holes in the car. Putting it all together, they came up with a clearer picture of what happened with Megan. Someone sideswiped her car on the driver's side, and she floored the gas pedal to get away. It seemed like the attacker sped ahead and disappeared out of sight because Megan ended up stopping at a traffic light. Maybe she figured the guy was long gone, but apparently he was lying in wait just up ahead, not far from that light. When she pulled to a stop, he started firing at her car. From what the ballistic expert said, those initial shots missed her, so she hit the gas again. But as Megan drove past the shooter, he fired one more time, and that bullet hit her in the stomach. That's when she lost control and veered onto the median. After that, Megan reached for her phone, which was in her purse. That's what the blood traces suggested. But right then, the attacker walked up to her car, and whatever happened next remained a total mystery. As soon as the details of what happened hit the media, this case blew up as one of the biggest topics in the whole county. People were terrified that some unknown psycho was out there blasting cars with an assault rifle, and they were demanding the police catch him immediately. Officers set up roadblocks to question as many drivers as possible. They were hoping to track down at least one person who'd driven through that morning. But all they found were a handful of folks who'd spotted Megan's car abandoned in the middle of the road. All of them just assumed some drunk had crashed and then ditched the scene. So none of these people bothered calling the cops. The detectives also launched a tip hotline, which got flooded with a few hundred calls. Most led straight to dead ends, but pretty soon the police got this pretty bizarre lead. An anonymous caller tipped them off, saying that on the morning of July 5th, he'd seen some guy stuffing what looked like Megan's body into the trunk of a burgundy sedan. Moreover, it all went down near these mountains with a seriously bad reputation where bodies turned up way too often. The detectives rushed out to search that spot right away, and they even released information about the burgundy sedan, hoping to find more witnesses. But in the end, it all came up empty. In the days that followed, investigators hit a total wall. They were starting to seriously doubt they'd ever find Megan alive. Still, they didn't let up. They poured everything they had into the case, chasing down every possible lead. With nothing solid to go on, police went back to Megan's closest friends and family, digging deeper to see if any suspect might have been hiding in plain sight. They even brought in handwriting experts to analyze her work documents, looking for any signs that she might have been stressed or anxious in the days leading up to her disappearance. Even with the dead ends piling up, the cops kept pushing forward with the search, and at one point, they stumbled across a human skull up in the mountains. Experts jumped on it and quickly figured out it belonged to a man who'd vanished the year before. A few weeks after Megan went missing, the police put out a $25,000 reward for information, and later they rolled out a website dedicated to the case, complete with details and a form for submitting tips. A little while later, investigators brought in a well-known profiler named Sharon Hagen. She'd later go on to help create the movie Zodiac and several true crime shows about killers. After digging through every detail of the case, she concluded that the perpetrator most likely had a sexual motive. The detectives didn't agree with it. They were convinced it was some kind of road rage incident that just spiraled out of control. Sharon, though, was positive the guy had kidnapped Megan to sexually assault her. What's more, she believed this wasn't his first time pulling something like this, and she even dug up a few other cases that could tie back to the same criminal. 2 years before this all went down, a woman named Joanna was just chilling in her bed when a man in a mask, armed with a knife, burst into her room. He claimed he was a cop and ordered her to strip down completely. Then he grabbed her car keys, shoved her into the passenger seat, and drove her to a park where a blanket was already spread out on the grass. There, he assaulted her, and afterward, he just drove the poor woman back home like nothing happened. Then there was another incident just a few days before Megan vanished. A 22-year-old woman named Donna was walking down the street when out of nowhere, a man dressed head to toe in black jumped out from the bushes. Knife in hand, he forced her to toss her phone into the bushes and get into his car. Right there in the vehicle, he sexually assaulted her, then blindfolded her and took her to some house, where he continued assaulting her. After he was done, he actually started comforting her. He promised he'd let her go in time for her morning shift at work and even offered her a soda. Eventually, he drove her back to the spot where he'd grabbed her and even helped her find her phone in the bushes. As soon as she was safe, Donna called the cops and gave them a full description of the guy, but they never tracked him down. Still, the detectives weren't quick to link this to Megan's disappearance, so they kept chasing down any fresh leads they could find. But all their efforts just kept hitting dead ends. Things dragged on like that for a few more days until the case took this totally unexpected twist. On July 26th, a man from a nearby town called the cops and reported that his neighbor had burglarized his house. Officers arrested 31-year-old Vincent Sanchez and found out he was living with 2 roommates, one of whom owned an AK-47, and Sanchez had easy access to it. That said, the police in this town had no idea about Megan's case, so the fact that he had this kind of rare weapon, something most regular folks don't just have lying around, barely raised an eyebrow. They hauled Sanchez off to jail, where he made a call to one of his roommates and asked for a huge favor. Get rid of this bag he tossed into a dumpster near the house. The roommate figured the bag must have had the stolen stuff from the neighbor's place, since the cops still hadn't recovered any of it. So he fished out the bag and peeked inside. But what he found was nothing like what he expected. It was packed with a bunch of videotapes. Curiosity got the best of him. He wanted to know why Sanchez was so freaked out about the cops finding these tapes. So he took them home and popped one in. To his absolute horror, the footage showed tied-up women being assaulted by a guy in a ski mask. The man was talking to his victims, and right away, the roommate recognized Sanchez's voice. Some of those videos were even filmed right in the house they shared. The roommate realized Sanchez had been bringing his victims there, and he'd had no clue the whole time. Then, he noticed the back wasn't just tapes. There were several pairs of women's underwear in there, plus a ton of photos of women in explicit poses. He didn't recognize most of them, but one stood out. It was Sanchez's girlfriend, the one he'd been dating for 3 years. In the end, the roommate called the police, and officers showed up to grab the bag. They also searched Sanchez's room, turning up even more photos of women, plus a few pairs of women's underwear and all sorts of female belongings. And that wasn't all. There were knives, a shotgun, handcuffs, and a video camera. So what started out as a simple theft investigation snowballed into something far darker and much bigger. The cops realized that all the women in those videos were Sanchez's victims, and now they had the grim task of figuring out who they were. As the full scale of it sank in, they called in Sharon, the profiler we mentioned earlier. Turns out, she'd already been tracking a serial predator who'd been assaulting women across the city for years, and she'd been studying every one of his victims in detail. There were over 10 of them, and Sharon spotted them instantly on those tapes. She was convinced Sanchez was the guy behind it all, but him wearing a mask in every recording threw a major wrench in the police's work. As she pored over the footage, Sharon caught another creepy red flag. It looked like the attacker had been stalking his victims for a while before striking. He'd casually drop personal details about their lives, like what school they'd gone to, who they were seeing, or where they worked. In trying to connect Sanchez to all these crimes, Sharon thought back to Donna's kidnapping, which went down just a few days before Megan disappeared. Donna had told the cops the guy wasn't wearing any mask at all and gave them a solid description of his looks. Sharon was convinced it was the same creep behind it, so she reached out to Donna and had her come down to the station. There, they set up a lineup with a few men, Sanchez among them. Without a second of hesitation, Donna pointed straight at him and said he was the one who grabbed her. By that point, Sanchez was already staring down a serious prison sentence. But Sharon wasn't done yet. She wanted to prove he was behind every single attack. Then, she learned he had access to an AK-47. And since all his crimes revolved around sexual assault, she immediately started to suspect he might also be behind Megan's kidnapping. She tipped off the detectives about this, and they went to Sanchez's place to take a look at the rifle. His roommate, the one who actually owned it, showed it to them, and right away they noticed it was missing the cleaning rod, that thin metal piece that clips under the barrel. The roommate said it had just gone missing, and that's when the investigators realized Sanchez might really be tied to Megan's case, because a matching cleaning rod had been found near her car, and it even helped prove that her vehicle had been hit with the rounds from an AK-47. From there, the detectives asked the roommate if they could take a look around Sanchez's room. They didn't have a warrant yet, but since one of the housemates gave them permission, they were clear to check it out. Their colleagues had already picked up anything that seemed suspicious, but there was one thing they'd clearly missed: a woman's jacket lying right there on the floor. It matched the one Megan was wearing the night she disappeared. So the officers quickly got a warrant and rushed that jacket straight to the lab. While the investigators waited on those lab results, they sat down with Sanchez's roommates and asked them about his whereabouts on July 4th. According to them, a bunch of friends swung by that evening and they celebrated Independence Day until around 10 p.m. After that, the guests started heading out, but Sanchez kept knocking back drinks with one of the roommates. Before long, that guy called it a night and went to bed, leaving Sanchez to crash on the living room floor since one of the guests had already taken his room. When the roommate woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom, Sanchez was nowhere to be seen in the living room. 2 hours later, he got up again and Sanchez was still gone. That's when he heard some strange noises coming from outside and looked out the window. To his surprise, there was Sanchez, scrubbing down his pickup truck. It just fell off. Who washes their car at 4 in the morning? The other roommate rolled out of bed around 5:30, and Sanchez was still at it, cleaning his car. Later on, he commented that the truck looked way fresher, especially after he'd shampooed the seats. One roommate's girlfriend noticed a fresh, long scratch on the pickup and asked Sanchez what happened. He brushed it off, saying he'd been caught in traffic and someone had bumped into him. On top of that, detectives talked to Sanchez's best friend who said that on July 4th, he'd been really down because things with his girlfriend were falling apart. That night, he kept calling her over and over, but she just wouldn't pick up. The detectives then found out that the house of his girlfriend's sister, where a holiday party had been held, was just a stone's throw away from Megan's friend's place. They started piecing together a theory. Sanchez might have headed there, planning to confront his girlfriend. But by the time he showed up, the party was already over. As for the AK-47, they knew he'd thrown around death threats to her family members who tried to talk her out of dating him. So it's possible he grabbed the rifle to scare them. But when he got there, everyone in the house was already asleep. Left alone on that dark, empty street, Sanchez could have spotted Megan saying goodbye to her friend and decided to tail her, leading to the attack. As detectives were piecing everything together, Sanchez, cornered and out of options, finally confessed to assaulting multiple women. With a mountain of evidence stacked against him, he knew there was no escaping it. He admitted to stalking his victims, digging into their personal lives, and even sneaking into their homes to study the layout before abducting them. But when it came to Megan, he flat out refused to admit any involvement. The detectives, though, were almost certain she was dead by this point. And after talking to Sanchez's best friend, they had a hunch about where her body might be. Apparently, Sanchez had once taken his buddy to a canyon and casually mentioned it'd be a great spot to hide bodies. The police rallied volunteers and headed out to search the area. Around 3,000 people pitched in, but the rough terrain made the whole thing a slow grind. Meanwhile, the lab came back with results. They found tiny specks of blood on the jacket from Sanchez's apartment, and DNA analysis confirmed it was Megan's. Using luminol, they also uncovered massive bloodstains in Sanchez's van, but he'd scrubbed it so thoroughly that no DNA could be pulled from it. While they kept hunting for more evidence, the cops brought search dogs to the canyon, and it paid off. One of the dogs zeroed in on a small ravine off the beaten path, and the officers found human remains at the bottom. The body was too decomposed to identify by sight, but they spotted a ring on the victim's hand, identical to the one Megan wore. Later, medical examiners confirmed the victim's identity. It was indeed Megan. They determined she'd been hit by a single bullet that didn't strike any vital organs, but due to the advanced decomposition, they couldn't tell if she'd been sexually assaulted, though they did uncover one chilling detail. She was wearing someone else's underwear. Knowing Sanchez had forced some of his victims to wear underwear he provided, the detectives figured he likely did the same to Megan, and probably assaulted her too. At that point, the detectives had enough evidence to take this case to court, but the forensic team dug up even more. While examining the interior of Sanchez's pickup, they found a few specks of glitter. Similar glitter was found in the victim's hair and on her jacket. One of Megan's friends had brought some to the party, and they'd all put it in their hair for fun. The experts studied the glitter under a microscope and found it was pretty rare, hexagonal in shape, with a color that shifted depending on the angle. And here's the kicker. They found an identical piece of glitter on the AK-47 Sanchez had access to. With that, the prosecutor's case got even tighter, linking him directly to the murder. On August 10th, Sanchez was hit with 62 charges, including the assaults on 13 other women, and those were just the cases where the police had solid evidence against him. A few months later, on October 4th, Sanchez tried to plead guilty to Megan's murder, but the judge rejected it over a technicality. Sanchez wouldn't admit to a specific degree of murder or acknowledge any aggravating factors, which was a big deal since the prosecution was pushing for the death penalty. Those details were critical, so he still had to face a full trial. His lawyer argued there was no way the court could sentence Sanchez to death, claiming the prosecution couldn't prove Megan was alive during any assault, which meant they lacked the extra circumstances needed for a death sentence. Even so, the charges stuck and the trial started in 2003. The defense didn't even try to argue his innocence. They just pushed the idea that Sanchez didn't plan to kill her. But the prosecution's evidence was airtight and the jury wasn't buying it. So eventually they found him guilty of first-degree murder. Sanchez got the death penalty, but just 3 years later, California slapped a moratorium on executions. So he ended up stuck in prison, serving a life sentence where he's been ever since. He's 55 now, and odds are he'll spend the rest of his days behind bars. In the end, this twisted case was finally solved, but investigators still haven't ruled out the possibility that Sanchez had more victims. Megan was likely the only one he killed, but when it comes to the sexual assaults, that question still hangs in the air to this day. A law student stopped responding to her loved ones, and soon they raised the alarm. Once the police got involved, the case began to unfold with twists and turns you wouldn't find even in a crime thriller. And when detectives finally uncovered the truth, the story turned into one of the most sinister and chilling cases in the country's history. Lauren Giddings was born on April 18, 1984, in Tacoma Park, Maryland. She grew up in a loving family, with caring parents and two younger sisters she was especially close to. From a young age, Lauren had a deep faith and a strong desire to help others. That's why she chose to become a public defender, someone who stands up for people who can't afford a lawyer. To make that dream a reality, she enrolled at Mercer University and moved to Macon, Georgia. Lauren excelled in her studies and even became president of Mercer's chapter of the Federalist Society. She later landed an internship at a law firm in Atlanta, where she met a man named David, and the two soon started dating. After she returned to Macon, they kept their relationship going long distance and planned to get married once Lauren finished law school. In the summer of 2011, when Lauren was 27, she finally graduated. But there was still one big milestone ahead, the bar exam. She spent weeks preparing for it, taking a short break only to attend her younger sister's wedding back home in Maryland. After the celebration, she returned to Georgia and joined her classmates for a small end-of-year party. Not long after that, she told her friends and family she was going to spend the next few days completely focused on studying and asked them not to disturb her. From that moment on, no one heard from Lauren. At first, her friends and family assumed she was just busy preparing for the exam. But a few days later, on June 29th, her sister started to worry. She was on her honeymoon at the time and had been sending her photos from the trip, but Lauren hadn't opened a single message. Her sister knew Lauren was focused on studying, but the fact that she hadn't even read the messages for days felt unsettling. Worried, she reached out to one of Lauren's friends and asked her to check if everything was okay. The friend tried calling first, but the calls went straight to voicemail. So, she and her boyfriend decided to drive over to Lauren's apartment, a small student housing complex right across from the university. The first thing they noticed was that Lauren's car was still parked outside, but when they knocked, no one answered. Her friend had a spare key, so after a moment's hesitation, she decided to let herself in. Inside, the place was a mess, but that wasn't necessarily alarming. Lauren was supposed to move in with her boyfriend, David, the very next day, so there were bags and suitcases scattered everywhere. But Lauren herself was nowhere to be found. On the other hand, her purse, phone, even laptop were still there. None of it made any sense. Where could she have gone, leaving behind all of her things, and even her car? The friends started calling around, reaching out to people who knew Lauren, and soon several of them joined the search. They combed the university grounds and nearby streets, but there was no sign of her. They also learned that no one had seen or spoken to Lauren for days. When her family found out what was happening, they drove from Maryland to Georgia to help. Meanwhile, her friends kept searching through the night, but when morning came and there was still no trace of her, they finally decided to call the police. Officers arrived at the apartment complex and searched Lauren's unit, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry or a struggle. Still, her sudden disappearance seemed deeply suspicious, so they called in forensic specialists to process the scene. The team began spraying luminol around the apartment, looking for traces of blood. At first, nothing unusual showed up, but the moment they reached the bathroom, the luminol lit up almost the entire tub. It was clear that a large amount of blood had been cleaned up there. From that point on, detectives feared the worst. It was just too much blood for anyone to still be alive, so investigators quickly shifted their focus to finding Lauren's body. While officers were standing outside, one of them caught a strong, foul odor, one he instantly recognized as the smell of decomposition. Following the scent, he walked toward the apartment complex's dumpsters. The closer he got, the stronger the stench became, and when he finally lifted the lid on one of them, he saw a large black garbage bag, and inside that bag was a woman's torso. Although the victim's identity couldn't be confirmed visually, since her head was missing, detectives were almost certain it was Lauren. Still, they decided to keep the discovery quiet for the moment, not wanting to jeopardize the investigation. It's worth noting that finding the remains was pure luck. The officer had arrived at the complex just minutes before the garbage truck was scheduled to pick up the trash, and they'd parked their cars in a way that blocked the truck from entering. If not for that small coincidence, the body would have been taken to the landfill and most likely never found. As detectives waited for confirmation of the victim's identity and tried to figure out their next steps, they learned something that immediately caught their attention. Lauren's friends and family told them she'd been complaining for weeks about strange things happening in her apartment. She said that sometimes, when she came home, it felt like someone had moved her belongings around, but there were no signs of a break-in, and the door was always locked. This had been going on for quite a while, to the point where Lauren started wondering if she was losing her mind. On top of that, she sometimes felt like someone was watching her, though she never actually saw anyone. Growing increasingly uneasy, she even bought a door security bar to brace the door from the inside. But the strange things didn't stop. Shortly before she disappeared, Lauren had told her boyfriend about it. He tried to calm her down, suggesting it was probably just some pranksters fooling around and that she had nothing to worry about. Police quickly looked into her boyfriend David and found that he'd been out of state during the time of the murder. There was no way he could have done it, so they ruled him out almost immediately. Meanwhile, forensic investigators combed through Lauren's apartment, looking for fingerprints or any other trace evidence. But it looked as if someone had done a meticulous cleaning job. Every surface seemed freshly wiped down with cleaning products. In hopes of finding something, they decided to remove the entire bathtub and send it to the lab for DNA testing. Not long after, medical examiners confirmed that the torso found in the dumpster was indeed Lauren's, officially turning the case into a homicide. They estimated that she'd been killed around June 26th, roughly 3 days before her friends and family started looking for her. However, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined, and there were no signs of sexual assault. Despite detectives' efforts to keep the investigation under wraps, the sudden police activity drew attention from reporters. Soon, journalists were gathering outside the apartment complex, filming news segments and spreading rumors that the police had found a body, even though, officially, no one had confirmed that yet. Detectives decided to question everyone living in the complex and check their apartments, just in case the killer was someone who lived right next door. All of the residents, who were also Mercer Law students, immediately agreed to let the police in without a warrant. All except one 25-year-old Stephen McDaniel. Stephen lived right next door to Lauren, but he flat out refused to let officers into his apartment. He told them that, as a law student, he strongly believed in protecting his privacy and that he had nothing to hide. Naturally, that raised a lot of red flags for investigators. They started looking into him and quickly learned that Stephen had actually been helping with the search for Lauren the previous day, and that he'd even given an interview to reporters earlier that morning. He wasn't just some random neighbor. He'd been her classmate, a fellow law student, and even served as vice president of the same student law society where Lauren was president. So yes, he knew her very well, but for some reason, he was refusing to let police see his apartment. And yet, he stayed right in the middle of everything happening around the complex, hovering near officers, chatting with other residents, and talking to journalists. During the interview, Stephen told reporters how he and a few of Lauren's friends had gone into her apartment and searched the neighborhood, trying to find her. But while talking about Lauren, he started referring to her in the past tense, even though at that point no one yet knew for sure she was dead. Yeah, Lauren was my neighbor. We're just trying to find out where she is at this point. I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. The last time anyone heard from her was an email that she sent out, and no one's heard from her since. Did you see her hang out with anyone at the time, anything like that? No one has seen her since Saturday. I haven't seen anything. You always hear noise outside, but it's just people walking by pretty much. And she just recently graduated from Mercer? Yeah, she and we were both JD students. We graduated back in May. What kind of person was she? What did you see? She's as nice as can be. Very personable, very much a people person. Do you know anybody any enemies you might have had? Somebody that might want to hurt her? No, we all know where she is. The only thing we can think is that maybe she went out running and someone snatched her. Because, we went over. One of her friends had a key. We went inside and tried to see if there was anything amiss. But, she had a door jamb that was sitting right by it. So there was no sign that anyone broke in. The door was locked when everyone got here. We just don't know where she is. When the reporters mentioned that police might have found a body near the dumpsters, Stephen went completely silent. His face changed instantly. He froze, staring off into space, not saying a word. The journalists kept talking, asking if he was okay, and after a few seconds, Stephen quietly said he needed to sit down. What about in the parking lot area? I know they've been doing a lot of... I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there. Body. Had you seen anything there? Had you seen anything there? We don't know if this is the same person. You know what I mean? They took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. That's why we're trying to ask people if they know who lived there. Are you okay, sir? I think I need to sit down. Eventually, he resumed the interview, trying to answer questions again, though now he was acting very dramatic. I don't know anyone that would want to hurt her. She was as nice a person as there is. What's going on in your mind right now? What are you thinking? Why would anyone do this? She didn't hear anything? No. She didn't see anybody? I just heard something. Maybe I could have helped. Okay, don't worry. Do you want to sit down for a second? And after the reporters left, Stephen just sat there for a long time, completely still, staring off into the distance. A few hours later, Stephen suddenly changed his mind and told police they could search his apartment after all. The moment detectives stepped inside, they were hit with what looked like organized chaos. Large piles of canned food, energy drinks, random junk, and a lot of weapons. But what really caught their attention came next. Hidden among his things were 2 keys, a master key that could open any door in the complex, and another one, a duplicate that fit Lauren's apartment specifically. When they confronted him, Stephen admitted that he'd broken into several neighboring units when the tenants weren't home, and in one case, he'd stolen a box of condoms. Strangely, he added that he was a virgin, but he never explained why he took them in the first place. Detectives decided to use that confession to their advantage. They arrested him for burglary and took him down to the station for questioning. Meanwhile, officers continued searching his apartment, and that's when they found an empty hacksaw package. Considering the killer had dismembered the victim, this discovery sent an immediate chill through the room. But the deeper they looked, the worse it got. Police found 2 USB drives filled with illegal material involving minors, along with a pair of women's underwear hidden in the closet. When investigators checked his computer, they discovered that Stephen had been visiting Lauren's social media pages obsessively. At the same time, his browser history showed he'd been consuming violent and disturbing adult content, sometimes while looking at Lauren's photos. And even that wasn't the end of it. Detectives found links to online forums where Stephen had been writing graphic stories about murdering and torturing women. And one of the final searches in his browser history was the trash collection schedule for their city. All of this convinced detectives beyond any doubt that Stephen was involved in Lauren's murder. To them, it was clear that he'd been obsessed with her. And since he had a key to her apartment, plus Lauren's repeated complaints about things being moved around while she was gone, the picture started to come together. Stephen had been sneaking into her home all along. Still, there was one major problem. They didn't yet have any solid evidence directly linking him to the crime. During questioning, detectives tried everything they could to get a confession, but Stephen's behavior was pretty weird. For hours, he sat motionless, answering in a barely audible voice, repeating only 3 phrases, yes, no, and I don't know. And you've lived next to Lauren for a long time? Yes. Have you ever seen her with that dress on? No. You have no idea where she's at? No. Just tell me what happened, brother. I don't know. The detectives grew increasingly frustrated. They pressured him, even tried the classic bluff, claiming they'd found his DNA at the crime scene and that the only thing that could help him now was to confess. But Stephen, who'd studied law himself, didn't fall for it. He stayed completely calm, emotionless, and silent. You know what's crazy? I was talking to people that he works with and everything. They talk about how he always expresses himself. No, but he don't know it. He's very talkative. Stephen, they say you're so talkative, buddy, that you're always so friendly. You stop in and say hello and you talk. Why is it that you're acting so short with us tonight? If you have all this character and personality about you, why is it that everything that we get from you is yes, no, or I don't know? Well, you sure were talking to the media tonight, weren't you? They asked what happened. Yeah, that's what we're asking you. What happened? What did you tell them? I told them what I knew, that you didn't know. Do you realize how you're talking right now? Does it not feel weird to you? No. Would you say that this is how you talk all the time? I don't understand. You're just not expressing yourself at all. Everything that's with you is yes, no, I don't remember. I don't understand. You can't help me out with anything. There's nothing you can tell me to help me about this beautiful girl right here. Stephen, that was your friend. Nothing. You gonna let things go down like this? I don't know what you want. I want the truth, Stephen. We just wanted to give you an opportunity to tell it. So you didn't look like a monster at the end. Because you know what? I don't believe that you're a monster, Stephen. I believe that you're a good guy. You've been pinked on. Girls didn't show you the respect that you deserved. You did something stupid. And I believe you feel bad about it. And that's why you're all freaked out right now. But I'm giving you the opportunity to get right. I'm giving you an opportunity to show everybody you're not a monster. That you feel bad about what happened. Your hair is there, man. Your hair is there. We got your hair with the body. How's that, Stephen? I don't know. Yes, you do know. Yes, you do know, Stephen. That's right, buddy. See that? Look at it. See how easy it happens. And it happened to you. Why, Stephen? I don't understand. Oh, you understand? You understand exactly what I'm saying. See this stuff right here, your hair? Yeah, it fell out of your head when you was moving the body, Stephen. That's right. You remember moving the body? Yeah. Yes, you do, Stephen. Eventually, the detectives left him alone in the interrogation room, and Stephen just sat there for a long time, perfectly still, staring blankly at the wall. Just stay right here, okay? Okay. I appreciate all your cooperation tonight. Okay? Okay. Officers also asked him to remove his shirt so they could check for any recent injuries. That's when they noticed several scratches across his torso, marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. When asked about them, Stephen simply said he had no idea where they came from. Maybe, he suggested, he'd scratched himself in his sleep. Police eventually realized there was no way they'd get a confession out of Stephen. So they shifted their focus to finding hard evidence. They began combing through every inch of the apartment complex, and soon they caught a break. In a maintenance room, officers discovered a hacksaw that perfectly matched the packaging found in Stephen's apartment. It had clearly been scrubbed clean, but forensic experts still managed to find tiny fragments of human tissue on the blade, and DNA tests confirmed they belonged to Lauren. From there, detectives traced the purchase of that same saw back to a local hardware store and pulled the surveillance footage from that day. On the video, clear as day, was Stephen McDaniel buying the saw himself. Investigators also interviewed the maintenance worker who had access to that room, but the man provided a solid alibi for the night of the murder. That left only one person who could have opened the door. Stephen, the man with a master key. Detectives then started digging deeper into his background and talking to people who knew him. Everyone described Stephen as quiet, withdrawn, and just strange, but also very intelligent. Several classmates mentioned that when he met new people, he would ask them two unsettling questions. What would you do in a zombie apocalypse? And how would you commit the perfect murder? Because of his odd behavior, he didn't really have any friends, and most classmates avoided him outside of school. The only person who ever tried to be kind to him was actually Lauren. She found him a bit unusual, but still treated him with respect and kindness. Over the 3 years they lived next door, Stephen had asked her out several times, but Lauren had always politely turned him down. Outside of school, he barely had a life. He spent nearly all of his time at home, with his curtains constantly drawn and no one ever coming or going. In the weeks following Stephen's arrest, police kept searching for more evidence, but every lead came up empty. They also continued combing through nearby areas, hoping to find the rest of Lauren's remains. But that search ended in failure too. The only thing detectives managed to uncover was a lab report confirming that the pair of women's underwear found in Stephen's apartment belonged to Lauren. But soon after, investigators discovered something that sent chills even down the spines of seasoned detectives. On one of the memory cards seized from Stephen's apartment, they found a video, recorded just hours before Lauren's death. Using a long wooden stick, Stephen had taped a small camera to the end of it and lifted it up to Lauren's window, secretly filming the inside of her apartment. That footage erased any lingering doubt about his guilt, and a few weeks later, formal charges were filed, not only for Lauren's murder, but also for 30 counts of possession of illegal material involving minors. As the case moved toward trial, Stephen pleaded not guilty, while prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty. His defense attorney, a former professor who had actually taught both Lauren and Stephen, claimed that police might have framed his client, planting evidence in the apartment to make him look guilty. He also argued against the death penalty, pointing out that Lauren herself had been publicly opposed to it. But in the end, the judge sided with the prosecution. The road to trial dragged on for years. The prosecution knew that, with the evidence they had, Stephen still stood a real chance of walking free, because to pursue the death penalty, they needed absolute, irrefutable proof. And the truth was, most of what they had was circumstantial, so a skilled defense attorney could easily plant doubt in the minds of the jury. After some consideration, the prosecution made a calculated decision. They offered Stephen a plea deal. If he confessed in full detail and pled guilty to the murder, the state would drop all the charges related to illegal materials and, more importantly, take the death penalty off the table. In 2014, 3 years after Lauren's death, Stephen finally agreed. According to his confession, around 4:30 in the morning, he dressed entirely in black from head to toe, mask and gloves included. Using the spare key, he quietly unlocked Lauren's door and slipped inside, managing to bypass the door brace she used for extra security. Stephen crept into her bedroom and stood there for a while, just watching as she slept. Then, at some point, the floor creaked beneath him. Lauren woke up, startled, and when she saw a masked figure in her room, she told him to get out. That's when he jumped at her and started choking her while she fought back. At some point, Lauren managed to tear off his mask, and when she did, she saw it was Stephen. Lauren begged him to stop, but he didn't. The struggle went on for nearly 15 minutes before he finally realized she wasn't breathing anymore. Stephen then carried her body into the bathroom and left it there overnight. The next evening, he returned with tools, including a hacksaw, and spent several hours dismembering the body. He placed the remains into trash bags and scattered them across multiple dumpsters near the university. As for the torso, he dumped it in the bin beside their apartment complex, assuming the garbage truck would pick it up soon. Afterward, he cut up his mask, gloves, and shirt into small pieces and flushed them down the toilet. Stephen claimed he didn't really know why he killed Lauren. According to him, he'd suffered some kind of mental blackout and genuinely believed she was still alive afterward, which he said was why he took part in the search for her. But prosecutors didn't buy that story for a second. In their view, Stephen had been obsessed with Lauren for a long time. His social media history, the video he filmed through her window, and his disturbing online activity all pointed to someone consumed by dark fantasies about violence and control. The forums he frequented and the content he viewed made it clear. He was fascinated by inflicting pain on women. And with Lauren just days away from moving out of the apartment complex, prosecutors believed he acted out of desperation. He couldn't stand the thought of losing sight of her forever. Either way, his confession sealed his fate. Stephen McDaniel was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2041. For years later, he filed an appeal, and this time he decided to represent himself. He argued that police had violated his rights from the very beginning, yelling at him during interrogation, refusing to let him use the bathroom without permission, and even denying him medical help during what he claimed was a seizure, unless he allowed them to search his apartment. He also accused his former attorney of failing to defend him properly. The lawyer, in turn, responded that Stephen had been given a remarkably good deal, life with a chance of parole instead of a death sentence, and that no attorney could have done better under the circumstances. Despite his efforts, the appeal was denied. In 2022, Stephen filed yet another one, but that too was rejected. It's worth mentioning that some of his relatives still insist he was framed. His father even created a fundraising page to hire a new lawyer for him. But no one donated a single dollar, and the page was quickly taken down. So, Stephen remains behind bars to this day, still trying to overturn his conviction. But according to most legal experts, the odds are stacked against him, and it's almost certain he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button. A young family moved into a quiet, peaceful apartment complex, thinking they found the perfect home. But just days later, their lives turned into a nightmare. What happened shocked the entire country, and though the case was solved pretty quickly, its impact still echoes to this day, sparking important changes in the law. Michael Bush was born on February 13, 1997, in the Canadian province of Alberta. She grew up there with her parents and a younger sister, who was not only incredibly close to her, but also saw her as a role model throughout their lives. Mikhail was a cheerful, energetic, and kind girl, which naturally drew people to her and earned her many friends. One of her biggest passions in life was ice skating. From a young age, she and her parents would often visit local rinks, and over time, it became something she truly loved. While in high school, Mikhail met a boy named Cody, and the two began dating. It didn't take long for them to realize they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. So, after graduation, they started planning their future as a couple. After finishing school, Mikhail got a job at a charity organization that supported people with disabilities. She quickly grew passionate about the work and decided to pursue a career in healthcare so she could continue helping those in need. In 2017, Mikhail enrolled in a local college and earned her nursing degree. After graduating, she returned to her job at the charity center. But shortly after that, something else happened. Mikhail found out she was pregnant. She and Cody were over the moon with joy, and following the happy news, Cody proposed to her in the middle of a rink. In 2020, they welcomed their son, Noah, and began building their life together as a family. Cody worked in pipeline construction, which meant he was constantly traveling across Canada. It was quite tough. His wife and newborn either had to move around with him or spend weeks without seeing him. But in 2021, he got a new job that finally let him stay in one place. With this new job, the family moved to a small town called Hinton. It was a fairly remote area, but for the first time, Cody's work no longer required constant travel, and they could finally settle down and spend more time together. In early September 2021, Mikhail and Cody moved into their new apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of town. At the time, Mikhail was 24 years old, and their son Noah was just 16 months. The family was thrilled with their new home, surrounded by nature, parks, and a sense of peace and quiet. On September 16th, Cody left for work as usual, while Mikhail stayed home to take care of their son. His shift ended around 6 p.m. and he headed back, looking forward to spending the evening with his family. But to his surprise, neither Mikhail nor Noah was home. Cody checked every room, looked out into the yard, but there was no sign of them. At first, he thought Mikhail might have taken Noah for a walk to one of the nearby parks, but then he noticed something odd. Their son's stroller was still inside the apartment, which meant Mikhail couldn't have gone far with him. Then Cody noticed something even more unsettling. On the kitchen table, there were plates with half-prepared food, as if Mikhail had started making lunch, but suddenly stopped and left the house. Cody started to seriously worry and decided to check the nearby parks and playgrounds, thinking Mikhail and Noah might be there. But after searching everywhere, he couldn't find them and returned home. Hoping for answers, he began calling family and friends, thinking someone might have picked them up. That would have explained why Mikhail hadn't taken the stroller, but no one had seen her that day. On top of that, Cody kept trying to call her, but Mikhail wasn't answering her phone. The whole situation felt increasingly bizarre, and Cody decided it was time to call the police. By the time he made the call, one of his friends had arrived at the apartment complex to help. Together, They searched the area again before the police arrived, but couldn't find them. It seemed like Mikhail had vanished without a trace. The officers arrived shortly after and joined the search. They thoroughly checked the apartment complex, the wooded area behind it, and nearby streets. They also began going door to door, questioning residents in hopes of finding any clues about Mikhail and Noah's whereabouts. Before long, their efforts paid off. One neighbor mentioned seeing a woman who looked like Mikhail running away from the complex toward the road earlier that day. She wasn't screaming or calling for help, and her son wasn't with her. The police decided to follow up on this lead and asked the complex manager for access to the CCTV footage. They reviewed hours of recordings but couldn't find any sign of Mikhail. But then, something completely unexpected caught their attention. Around noon, the same neighbor who claimed to have seen Mikhail was captured on camera carrying 2 large garbage bags out of the building. The police went straight to the dumpster to examine the contents of those bags. When they opened one, they were met with a horrifying sight. Inside was Noah's body, along with some of Mikhail's belongings, including her phone. This discovery immediately changed the course of the investigation. Detectives knew they had to proceed carefully, as Mikhail's whereabouts were still unknown. They suspected the neighbor was directly involved in the crime and decided to search his apartment. But there was a problem. The man lived right next door to Mikhail's apartment, where Cody and other family members were waiting. The 2 apartments shared a wall, and the police were concerned that what they might find inside the neighbor's apartment could trigger an uncontrollable situation. To avoid this scenario, the officers came up with a plan. They asked Cody and his family members to temporarily leave their apartment, explaining that investigators needed to conduct a thorough examination. What they didn't tell Cody was that his son's body had just been discovered only a few dozen yards away. As soon as Cody left, the police went straight to the neighbor's apartment. They requested permission to search the unit, and the man voluntarily agreed. When investigators reached the bathroom, they found Mikhail. Her body was lying in the tub, completely unclothed. After this heartbreaking discovery, the neighbor, 53-year-old Robert Major, was immediately arrested, and detectives now had to piece together what had happened inside that apartment. While waiting for medical examiners to determine the exact causes of death, the police began looking into Robert's background, and what they found was truly shocking. Robert had an extensive criminal record spanning several decades. He had been charged more than 24 times, mostly for sexual offenses. But despite his repeated arrests, Robert had only served short prison sentences. During his time in custody, he was evaluated by multiple psychiatrists, and he openly admitted to them that he really enjoyed committing these acts and took pleasure in his crimes. With multiple expert evaluations on record, authorities knew for sure Robert was likely to reoffend. But instead of keeping him behind bars after his numerous crimes, he was released in 2016. The only measure the police took was to issue a public warning, informing the community about Robert and the threat he posed. Robert was also required to register in a special offender database. He was banned from living near women, children, schools, or playgrounds, prohibited from leaving his city, which was located about 190 miles from Hinton, and ordered to meet with a police representative on a regular basis. But these restrictions quickly became irrelevant. Canadian law basically removed individuals from the registry and lifted their restrictions if they went a year without committing another crime. Because of this, Robert fell off the radar of law enforcement several years before the tragedy. At some point, he moved to Hinton and settled in a residential complex filled with families and children. None of the local police officers were aware of his criminal history. The management of the apartment complex, even if they wanted to, had no way of accessing this information, let alone the residents themselves. Medical experts soon completed their examination of the bodies, while Robert, shortly after his arrest, gave a partial confession, and his words shocked even the most seasoned investigators. On top of that, they managed to gather additional evidence and witness statements that helped piece together the full picture of what happened on that fateful day. That morning, Mikhail and Noah went for a walk in the nearby park. When they returned home, the building manager approached Mikhail to discuss an issue. The problem was that Cody, who worked on pipelines, would often come home with his boots and clothes covered in dirt, leaving muddy tracks all the way to their apartment door. The manager asked Mikhail to address the situation, and she promised to clean it up right away. After their conversation, Mikhail went back inside, put Noah down for a nap, and started preparing lunch. Around this time, she also called a friend. This friend later recalled hearing a knock at Mikhail's door during their conversation, followed by a man's voice. He offered to help clean the hallway, but the friend didn't catch the rest of the exchange. Shortly after, Mikhail returned to the kitchen, finished her call, and sent a message to a family member around 2 p.m. From there, one critical question remained unanswered for investigators. How did Mikhail end up in Robert's apartment? Robert himself refused to clarify this particular moment, leaving police to speculate. Perhaps he lured her there under some pretense, maybe by continuing the conversation about cleaning the hallway or asking for her help with something else. One way or another, Mikhail ended up inside Robert's apartment, and this is where his confession began. Almost immediately after she walked through the door, he attacked her and tried to strangle her. But for nearly 10 minutes, he struggled to succeed. In the end, he managed to kill her and then essay her. He then dragged her body to the bathroom before heading to her apartment, where he took Noah and ended his life as well. After committing these horrific acts, Robert placed Noah's body, along with Mikhail's clothes and belongings, into garbage bags and dumped them in a container outside the building. It seemed he had no further plan, as Mikhail's body was simply left in the bathroom. Although he tried to mislead investigators by claiming that Mikhail had run off from the complex, possibly hoping that police wouldn't think to look inside his apartment. As for his motives, they remain unclear. The details of the case, including the full account of his confession, were never made fully public. Investigators shared only bits of information with media, leaving room for speculation. The reason behind Mikhail's murder was relatively straightforward. Not only did Robert find satisfaction in causing harm, but he also killed her with the intent of essay. However, Noah's murder was more perplexing. Investigators suggested that Robert may have killed him out of fear that Noah could identify him. Another theory is that Noah woke up and started crying, which may have scared Robert, thinking the noise could draw attention from the neighbors. One way or another, Robert's main motive became crystal clear through his numerous conversations with psychiatrists. He simply took genuine pleasure in harming others, especially those who were physically weaker than him. It's worth noting that even prison didn't stop him. During one of his previous sentences, Robert assaulted a cellmate, which led to additional charges. With news of this case spread across the country, many were horrified, not only by the brutality of the crime, but also by the fact that such a dangerous man had been allowed to live freely. Public outrage grew even stronger when details of what happened during the trial came to light, but more on that later. Robert openly admitted to psychiatrists that he enjoyed committing such crimes, and all of them agreed there was a very high likelihood he would do it again. But despite this, he was released back into society, and eventually, authorities stopped monitoring him altogether. The residents of that complex had no way of knowing about his criminal past either. Even if he had remained on a sex offender registry, the system in Canada works very differently than in the US. In Canada, only law enforcement officials can access the registry, not the general public. This left many Canadians outraged as the laws prioritized protecting the privacy of a predator but failed to protect Mikhail and her son. The family had moved into that complex just 15 days before the tragedy, only to become victims of a man who lived literally next door. This devastating injustice pushed Cody and the rest of the family to fight for change. They became actively involved in drafting a new piece of legislation named in Noah's memory. The main goal of the bill was to ensure that repeat offenders are monitored for their entire lives, not just for a short period after their release. The bill also proposed creating a public registry of these offenders so anyone could easily check if someone with a criminal past was living in their area. As for Robert, he didn't deny his guilt, so the trial moved pretty quickly. But before sentencing, his final statement shocked everyone and once again raised the question of why someone like him was ever released. He openly admitted that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life because even he would fear what he might do if he were ever free again. At the same time, he claimed he still saw himself as a good person, despite everything he had done. In the end, Robert was sentenced to life in prison, but there was a catch. He would still be eligible for parole in 25 years. If he lives that long, he'll be 78 years old, and there's no guarantee he wouldn't still pose a threat to others, even at that age. As for the bill the victim's family is fighting for, progress has been frustratingly slow. Despite years of advocacy, the legislation still hasn't been passed, and it's unclear if it ever will be. A young mother came home from a grocery store and vanished under mysterious circumstances. When police began their investigation, they thought the answer to the mystery was pretty obvious. But what they uncovered shocked even the most seasoned detectives, as none of them could have predicted what was coming. Kelsey Barrett was born on September 15, 1989, in Moses Lake, Washington. She grew up on a farm with her parents and older brother, helping with all kinds of chores from a young age. She loved working on the farm, but what fascinated her most were the crop-dusting planes, those small aircraft that sprayed fields or scattered seeds. Kelsey had always dreamed of flying one, and as soon as she graduated high school, she enrolled in a local college to become a pilot. After earning her license, she got a job as a flight instructor while still helping her parents on the farm. Teaching people how to fly and working with her family kept her busy, but more than anything, Kelsey dreamed of having a family of her own. In 2016, when Kelsey was 27, she finally got the chance to start the family she'd always dreamed of. She met a man named Patrick online, and they hit it off right away. Like Kelsey, he was a farmer, and he shared her desire to have a big family. They talked for months before Kelsey decided to move to Colorado to be with him, and around the same time they got engaged. Shortly after settling in, she landed a job as a flight instructor at a prestigious aviation school that specialized in training military pilots. It was a great opportunity, but there was one downside. The school was in another city, about 70 miles from Patrick's farm. Because of the long commute, Kelsey rented a place in town called Woodland Park. It was closer to work, but still within a reasonable distance from Patrick's home. Even though they had to live apart, they spent as much time together as possible, and their relationship moved quickly. In early 2017, Kelsey found out that she was pregnant, and soon after, the couple welcomed a baby girl. It seemed like Kelsey's dream of having a family was finally coming true. But not long after their daughter was born, things between her and Patrick started to fall apart. She noticed he was growing distant, pulling away from her, losing interest in their relationship, and showing less and less enthusiasm about their life together. Still, Kelsey wasn't ready to give up. She was determined to make things work and did everything she could to fix their relationship. On the morning of November 22, 2018, Thanksgiving Day, Kelsey planned to cook dinner for the holiday. She called her mom that morning, chatting about her plans and mentioning that she was heading to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for the meal. Over the next few days, Kelsey sent a few text messages to her mom, but then, out of nowhere, she stopped responding. At first, her mother assumed she was just busy. After all, Kelsey had a job and a 1-year-old daughter to take care of. But as the days passed and Kelsey continued to ignore calls and messages, her mom started to worry. Nearly a week had gone by without a single word from her. Growing increasingly concerned, she reached out to her older brother, hoping he had heard from Kelsey, but he said she hadn't responded to him either. Desperate for answers, Kelsey's mother decided to call Patrick, thinking he might know what was going on. But his response only made things more confusing. He claimed that he and Kelsey had broken up. According to Patrick, their breakup happened on Thanksgiving, more than a week earlier. He claimed that before the holiday, Kelsey told him she needed some time alone and wanted to end their relationship. Then, on Thanksgiving Day, she supposedly dropped off their daughter with him, took some of her things from his place, and he hadn't heard from her since. Kelsey's mother found his story hard to believe. For one, she couldn't imagine her daughter leaving her 1-year-old child behind without checking in, even once. And second, she had spoken to Kelsey on the very same day Patrick claimed all of this happened. Kelsey never mentioned a breakup. In fact, she had seemed completely fine. She was in good spirits and excited about cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Feeling uneasy, Kelsey's mom asked Patrick to go to her house and check on her. He agreed but said he needed to finish up some work on the farm first. But the call never came. He never followed up. At that point, Kelsey's mother knew something wasn't right, so she made the decision to contact the police. She explained the situation and the local department sent an officer to check her home. When they arrived, they found Kelsey's car parked outside. But there was no sign of her. No one answered the door, and since the police couldn't enter without a warrant, there wasn't much they could do. All they could tell Kelsey's mom was that her daughter wasn't there. However, officers did speak with Patrick, and he stuck to the same story. Kelsey had supposedly left him, saying she needed space. But this time, he added a new detail. She had taken some of her things from his house, including her handgun. He claimed she had been acting strangely in the days before she disappeared, and said he was worried she might have done something drastic. The police asked for access to Kelsey's home, and what they found inside only raised more questions. All of her belongings were still there, her clothes, documents, and other essentials she would have taken if she had left on her own. But one thing was missing: her car keys. Her car was parked outside, yet the keys were nowhere to be found. That didn't make much sense. It was hard to imagine a scenario where Kelsey would take her keys but leave her vehicle behind. At this point, the local police department decided to officially open an investigation into her disappearance. One of the first steps was obtaining data from her phone. When investigators checked its GPS history, they found that the last signal from Kelsey's phone had been recorded on November 25th, 3 days after she was last seen. It came from a small town called Gooding. The problem was that Gooding was in Idaho, about 800 miles from Kelsey's home. That didn't add up. When police spoke with her family, they confirmed that Kelsey had no friends, relatives, or any known connections there. They had no idea why she would have gone to such a remote place. Detectives reached out to law enforcement and Gooding for assistance, but their search turned up nothing. In such a small town, a newcomer would have stood out, yet there were no traces of Kelsey. That was odd, and investigators knew they needed to look elsewhere for answers. They reviewed CCTV footage from the grocery store Kelsey had visited on Thanksgiving. The video showed her acting completely normal. There was nothing unusual about her behavior. She wasn't in a hurry, didn't seem distressed, and certainly didn't look like someone planning to disappear. She picked up groceries for dinner and even bought a flower before leaving the store. Police conducted another search of Kelsey's home, but once again, they found no clues. Days passed without any breakthroughs, and in that time, Kelsey's mother and brother flew to Colorado to help with the search. They stayed at her house, and right away, her mother had an unsettling feeling. Something just didn't seem right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Then, one day, Kelsey's older brother went to use the bathroom and happened to notice something red on the inside of the toilet. Caught his attention, and when he looked closer, he realized it could be blood. He immediately reported it to the police, and tests confirmed his suspicion. Was human blood. But this discovery was just the beginning. Investigators had already searched the house once, but their examination had been fairly basic. This time, forensics decided to use luminol, a chemical that reveals traces of blood, even if it has been wiped away or cleaned to the point of being invisible to the human eye. They started spraying luminol in the bathroom, and what they saw was truly chilling. There was blood everywhere. It had been cleaned, but under the chemical reaction, it lit up across the walls and floor. The same thing happened in the living room. There were large stains of wiped-away blood, revealing a gruesome scene that had been carefully scrubbed from sight. Samples were sent to the lab, and the results confirmed what investigators feared most. The blood belonged to Kelsey, but there was something else. Among the samples, forensic experts discovered 2 additional DNA profiles, one belonging to a man, the other to a woman. At this point, detectives were almost certain Kelsey was no longer alive. Their focus now shifted to identifying the 2 unknown individuals whose DNA had been found in her home. Naturally, Patrick became the prime suspect. Investigators had already found his version of events suspicious, but now that they were almost certain Kelsey was dead, Their doubts about him only grew stronger. When they got access to Patrick's phone, they saw that he had been calling and texting Kelsey up until November 25th, the day she stopped responding to everyone else. Their messages mostly revolved around their breakup, but there was nothing particularly useful in the exchange. However, detectives were already leaning toward a different timeline. They believed Kelsey had actually been killed on Thanksgiving, November 22nd. The problem was that aside from those text messages, there was no real evidence that she had been alive for the next 3 days. That raised a terrifying possibility. Kelsey might have been murdered shortly after returning home from the grocery store, and if that was the case, someone else had been using her phone to send those messages. That's when detectives noticed something interesting. Patrick had repeatedly called a phone number with a Gooding area code, both before and after Kelsey disappeared. Wanting to know more, they traced the number and found that it belonged to a woman named Crystal. Investigators called her and asked how she knew Patrick. Crystal explained that they were essentially business partners. They co-owned several horses. When asked when she had last seen him, she initially claimed she couldn't remember, but after some hesitation, she admitted that they were supposed to meet right after Thanksgiving. According to her, she and Patrick had planned to buy another horse, so she drove to Colorado to see it herself. However, along the way, she found out that Patrick didn't have enough money for the purchase, so she turned around and went back home. Considering that the drive from her town to Patrick's was almost 1,000 miles, detectives found Crystal's story suspicious. It seemed unlikely that someone would embark on such a long road trip just to see a new horse. Adding to their doubts, Crystal claimed she hadn't even used her own car for the trip. Instead, she had borrowed a friend's vehicle because it was more fuel efficient. That detail felt oddly specific, almost as if she was trying to justify why her car wouldn't show up on any traffic cameras or toll records. Before ending the conversation, detectives asked Crystal if she knew Kelsey. She responded that she had heard about her on the news but had never met her in person. That statement immediately raised red flags. Crystal lived in another state, and at that point, Kelsey's disappearance hadn't yet made national headlines. So how would she have already heard about it? After wrapping up their call with Crystal, investigators decided to dig deeper into her background. They discovered that she had recently gone through a divorce, so they reached out to her ex-husband, hoping he could provide more insight. When detectives asked Crystal's ex-husband if he knew Patrick, his response completely contradicted what Crystal had told them. He revealed that she and Patrick had known each other since 2006. Patrick was actually her first love. Over the years, they had an on-and-off relationship but had always stayed in touch. Even more suspicious, her ex-husband claimed that their affair had never truly ended, not even after he and Crystal got married. According to him, she was still seeing Patrick in 2017, the same year he got engaged to Kelsey. But that wasn't all. Crystal had also lied to her ex-husband about her whereabouts after Thanksgiving. At first, she told him she had gone to visit friends from November 24th to 25th. But after the police contacted her, she finally admitted to him that she had actually been in Colorado. Then came another suspicious detail. On December 4th, Crystal asked her ex-husband to go with her to buy a new phone, claiming she had lost hers. Detectives immediately took note of the timing. December 4th was the exact same day they had obtained Patrick's phone for investigation. With all this information, investigators had enough evidence to obtain a warrant for Crystal's DNA sample. They flew to Idaho to collect it, and while Crystal complied with the request, she flat out refused to answer any of their questions. As they waited for the lab results, detectives reached out to the friend who had lent Crystal her car for the trip to Colorado. She allowed them to inspect the vehicle and mentioned that she kept a handgun inside. When investigators checked the gun, they noticed something alarming. One bullet was missing from the magazine. The friend was adamant that the gun had been fully loaded when she lent Crystal the car, and she had no idea where the missing bullet had gone. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators then spoke with another one of Crystal's friends, a woman named Michelle, and what she told them completely turned the case on its head. Michelle revealed that Crystal had called her in late October, about a month before Kelsey disappeared, and told her something shocking. Through tears, Crystal confided that Patrick had asked her to kill his fiancée. According to Michelle, Patrick told Crystal that Kelsey was mistreating their daughter. He insisted that he couldn't do it himself because it would be too obvious and he needed someone else to carry out the murder. During the conversation, Michelle urged Crystal to go to the police, but she never did. This revelation completely changed the course of the investigation. Police were now almost certain that both Patrick and Crystal were somehow involved in Kelsey's murder. But despite the mounting evidence, they still had no DNA results and, more importantly, no concrete proof of what had actually happened to Kelsey. As investigators continued searching for more evidence, the case took another unexpected turn. Crystal called them and said that she had hired a lawyer and was ready to talk. When detectives met with her, she didn't hesitate and dropped a bombshell. Crystal admitted that Patrick had killed Kelsey and confessed to cleaning up the crime scene afterward. According to Crystal, Patrick had been planning Kelsey's murder for months, but from the very beginning, he had intended for Crystal to be the one to carry it out. Just as she had told her friend Michelle, Patrick repeatedly insisted that Kelsey was abusing their daughter, using drugs, and drinking excessively. He convinced Crystal that getting rid of her was the only option. Crystal agreed to help Patrick, and 2 months before Kelsey's disappearance, they came up with their first plan. The idea was simple. Crystal would poison Kelsey's favorite coffee with some medication. Since Crystal was a nurse, she had easy access to the necessary drugs. But there was one big problem. Crystal and Kelsey had never met. To get around this, she and Patrick came up with a cover story. Crystal would pretend to be a new neighbor who had just moved to the area and was introducing herself to the locals. In September, she put their plan into motion. She grabbed Kelsey's favorite coffee, went to her house, and knocked on the door. When Kelsey answered, they made small talk for a few minutes before Crystal handed her the drink and said goodbye. But Crystal actually couldn't go through with it. She hadn't poisoned the coffee. She just wanted to see Kelsey in person. And just like that, their first attempt failed. Patrick's next plan was more direct. Crystal was supposed to drive to his farm, pick up a metal pipe he had prepared, go to Kelsey's house, and kill her. She drove nearly 1,000 miles, picked up the pipe, and even pulled up outside Kelsey's house. But once again, she couldn't go through with it. She sat there for a while, then drove off without ever stepping out of the car. But Patrick didn't give up. His third plan was almost identical to the last one. But this time, instead of a pipe, he left a baseball bat for Crystal to use. Once again, she took the long drive, picked up the weapon, and approached Kelsey's house. And once again, she couldn't go through with it. At that point, Patrick realized if he wanted Kelsey dead, he would have to do it himself. According to Crystal, it all happened in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. Patrick showed up at Kelsey's house with a twisted plan. He told her he had bought several holiday-scented candles and suggested they play a game. She would be blindfolded and try to guess the different scents. Kelsey went along with it, completely unaware of what was about to happen. As soon as Patrick tied the blindfold over her eyes, he grabbed the baseball bat and carried out the murder. What made it even more horrifying was that their 1-year-old daughter was in the next room the entire time. After killing Kelsey, Patrick placed her body in a large plastic container and loaded it into the trunk of his car. Then, as if nothing had happened, he took his daughter and drove to his family's Thanksgiving dinner. While his relatives gathered around the table laughing and celebrating, Kelsey's body sat just a few yards away, hidden inside his vehicle. After dinner, Patrick drove out to a small town called Cripple Creek, where he had rented a barn and left Kelsey's body there for several days. That same night, he called Crystal and told her she needed to come and clean up the mess he had made. She immediately understood. Kelsey was dead. Trying to cover her tracks, Crystal borrowed her friend's car, thinking it might help throw off investigators if the police ever looked into it. She then gathered a stash of cleaning supplies and set off for Colorado. While she was on the road, Patrick called her again. This time, he had a specific request. He warned her to be extra careful because he couldn't find one of Kelsey's teeth. He didn't want it turning up somewhere it shouldn't, especially not in front of Kelsey's family. When Crystal stepped into Kelsey's home, she was met with a horrifying scene. There was blood everywhere. It covered the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. She spent over 4 hours scrubbing the place, but some stains were impossible to remove, even with heavy-duty cleaning chemicals. So, she gathered anything that had blood on it, rags, towels, and other items, stuffed them into garbage bags, and loaded them into her car. After finishing the cleanup, she casually stopped at a cafe for something to eat before heading to meet Patrick. They stopped at a gas station where Patrick filled up a canister with gasoline. Then, they drove to the barn, retrieved Kelsey's body, and took it back to Patrick's farm. There, they built a fire and burned her remains. As they stood by the flames, Patrick's mother stepped outside. She watched them for a while, but whether she realized what was really happening remains unknown. Before Crystal left for home, Patrick handed her Kelsey's phone. For the next few days, she responded to texts from Kelsey's family and friends, trying to keep up the illusion that Kelsey was still alive. Eventually, she got rid of the phone, destroying the last trace of Kelsey's connection to the outside world. Despite helping Patrick cover up a brutal murder, Crystal insisted that she hadn't acted of her own free will. She claimed she had been terrified of becoming his next victim and only did what he asked out of fear for her life and for her children's lives. She said Patrick had threatened to harm them if she didn't cooperate. Before ending her confession, Crystal added that she had actually tried to help police catch Patrick, claimed that she had deliberately left a few bloodstains in Kelsey's home, hoping investigators would find them. The detectives were highly skeptical of this claim. Crystal had countless opportunities to go to the police and prevent the murder. Instead, she not only allowed Patrick to go through with it, but had been willing to kill Kelsey herself 3 separate times. And even after Patrick carried out the murder, she didn't come forward. She helped him clean up the crime scenes, dispose of the body, and mislead Kelsey's family and friends. In the end, her confession wasn't motivated by guilt or a sense of justice. The truth was, her lawyer had advised her to take a plea deal, one that would drop all charges against her except for a single count of evidence tampering related to destroying Kelsey's phone. Despite Crystal's detailed confession, police still needed solid physical evidence to take the case to trial. They had already searched Patrick's farm once and found nothing incriminating. But this time, with Crystal's help, they returned to the property, and she pointed out the exact spot where they had burned Kelsey's remains. Patrick had done a thorough job of covering it up, so investigators had to dig through layers of dirt and ash. Eventually, forensic experts uncovered traces of a burned body. However, there was almost nothing left that could be used for DNA analysis. The only piece of evidence was the tooth Crystal had found while cleaning up the crime scene. But even that was so badly damaged by fire, investigators couldn't conclusively prove it belonged to Kelsey. Still, there was one crucial breakthrough. By this time, the lab results from the DNA samples found in Kelsey's home had come in. The results confirmed what detectives already suspected. The 2 unidentified profiles belonged to Patrick and Crystal. That was the final piece of evidence they needed. Patrick was eventually arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He spent the next years behind bars while prosecutors built their case against him, refusing to admit any guilt. According to the prosecution, Patrick had multiple motives for wanting Kelsey dead. First, their relationship was falling apart, and he wanted nothing more to do with her. But since they had a child together, simply walking away wasn't an option, so he decided to get rid of her permanently. The second motive was financial. Patrick was struggling with some serious money problems and was at risk of losing part of his farming business. Investigators believe this could have also played a role in his decision to kill Kelsey. Even though prosecutors couldn't pinpoint a single clear-cut motive, by the time of the trial, investigators had gathered undeniable proof of Patrick's guilt. One of the biggest pieces of evidence came from his phone records. Data from his smartphone showed that he had spent several hours at Kelsey's home on the day of her murder. This directly contradicted his claim that he had only stopped by for a few minutes to pick up their daughter and drop off some of her belongings. CCTV footage from a neighbor's house further discredited his story. The video showed Patrick arriving at Kelsey's home with their daughter, but instead of leaving shortly after, as he claimed, he didn't come back outside for several hours. Then came another damning detail. After leaving Kelsey's home, Patrick's phone traveled to his farm, but Kelsey's phone moved with him. He hadn't even bothered to turn it off. For the next few days, Kelsey's phone remained near Patrick's, tracking alongside his movements, until he finally handed it off to Crystal, who had used it to send misleading texts before destroying it. On top of all this, detectives uncovered a wealth of surveillance footage linking Patrick to the crime. One camera captured him driving with the large plastic container, the same one he later used to hide Kelsey's body. Another camera at the gas station recorded him and Crystal filling up a gas canister, further confirming their involvement in destroying the remains. Then, during the trial, another disturbing detail came to light. An employee at a mobile carrier store testified that Patrick had come in on the same day police confiscated his phone, asking a very suspicious question. He wanted to know how to remotely wipe all data from a device. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from someone inside the jail. One of Patrick's cellmates revealed that, while awaiting trial, Patrick had made a hit list. On it were 3 names: Crystal, her ex-husband, and Kelsey's mother. He wanted them dead. All of this left no doubt Patrick wasn't just guilty, but he was still dangerous. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, along with Crystal's testimony, the jury unanimously found Patrick guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. As for Crystal, her plea deal got her an incredibly lenient sentence, just 3 years in prison. But a judge later reduced it to 18 months, with the possibility of early release after only a year. In the end, she served barely any time and has been free for a long time, despite the fact that she could have stopped the crime, but instead, she helped cover it up. On a more hopeful note, Kelsey's family was granted full custody of her daughter, and she has been living with them ever since. In honor of Kelsey's passion for flying, her parents also established a nonprofit that provides support to aspiring pilots, ensuring that her legacy lives on. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button. A mother of 2 vanished under strange circumstances, leaving behind a string of unsettling messages to her family. Police jumped on the case right away, trying to make sense of a web of contradictions. But not even the most seasoned detectives could have imagined where this investigation would lead. What began as a missing persons case soon spiraled into a story that would shock the entire country. Katie Kenyon was born in 1983 in the small British town of Burnley. She had 2 sisters, older and younger, and the 3 of them were incredibly close. Even as a kid, Katie stood out for her kindness and generosity. She was the type of person who would drop everything to help someone in need. Later in life, she got married and had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. But eventually, her husband left the family. He still saw the kids from time to time, but from that point on, Katie was raising them on her own, which wasn't easy. She worked as a social care worker, and her paycheck barely covered the basics. But no matter how hard things got, Katie did everything she could to make sure her children had what they needed. On the morning of April 2nd, 2022, 33-year-old Katie went about her usual routine, got her kids ready, and sent them off to school. But just a few hours later, around noon, her mom got a text from her that felt totally off. Katie said she needed some time away to clear her head and would be gone for a while. Her mom tried calling right away, but the call went straight to voicemail. And that's when the panic really started to set in. She knew Katie had been struggling with anxiety for years, mostly from all the stress in her life. But the idea that she'd just walk away from everything, especially her kids, that just didn't add up. Her mom got in touch with Katie's sisters, and none of them believed the message either. They rushed over to her house and noticed that her car was gone. Using a spare key, they let themselves inside and found all of Katie's belongings right where she'd left them, except for her phone and handbag. It just didn't add up. The idea that Katie had taken off somewhere, leaving behind almost everything she owned, felt completely wrong. Something was off. A little while later, Katie's kids came home from school, and they had something to say too. They'd both received strange messages from their mom. In the text, she said she needed to get help so she could be a better mother and asked them to contact their dad so he could look after them while she was away. As soon as they read the messages, Katie's mom and sisters started seriously doubting that she'd written them. First of all, the tone didn't sound like her at all. But more importantly, there was something else that really stood out. In both messages, the word while was misspelled, and that just didn't make sense because Katie never made mistakes like that. Then, her son mentioned something else. He said a man named Andrew had messaged him on social media. Andrew was Katie's ex, someone she dated for several years. In the message, he said Katie had checked herself into a clinic and asked him to take care of her dog until she got back. Katie's mom and sisters thought the whole thing was pretty strange. Sure, they'd known she'd dated Andy for a long time, but it had never been a smooth relationship. The two of them were on and off constantly. As far as her family knew, they weren't even together anymore. So it didn't make much sense that Katie would fill him in on her plans, but not say a word to her own mother or kids. In the messages she'd sent her son and daughter, Katie had also mentioned Andy. She said that if their dad couldn't look after them, Andy would step in. One of Katie's sisters eventually got a hold of his number and gave him a call. Andy told her he hadn't seen Katie since the day before, since he'd been at work all morning. He said that around 2 p.m., she texted him saying she was going to drop her car off at his place and that she was leaving the keys and her bank card in his mailbox. Katie had owed Andy a large sum of money, about £6,000, for anxiety treatment he'd helped her pay for in the past. So, according to him, this was her way of paying him back. In her next message, Katie said she was heading back to a clinic because she just couldn't handle the anxiety anymore. Andy said nothing about it struck him as odd, so he didn't think much of it. Still, Katie's sister wasn't buying Andy's story. Not one bit. So, she and her boyfriend decided to drive over to his place and see for themselves. The moment they pulled up, she spotted Katie's car parked outside. Inside, she could see Katie's purse and other personal belongings, which only made her more suspicious. She knocked on Andy's door, hoping to talk to him face to face, but he refused to open it and told them to leave. The whole thing felt incredibly off. Katie's sister couldn't wrap her head around why Andy didn't seem the slightest bit worried or why he was being so uncooperative. Her boyfriend ended up threatening to kick the door down if he didn't let them in, but Andy just called the police instead. A few minutes later, officers arrived and spoke with Katie's sister first. She laid everything out, how the family was worried sick, how they didn't believe for a second that Katie would just vanish without saying a word to anyone. She also pointed out her sister's car still parked there with her stuff inside. After that, the police knocked on Andy's door. He gave them the same story he told over the phone, that he'd been at work when Katie texted him about leaving her car, keys, and bank card, and said she was going to check herself into a clinic. He even let them search his house and his van, and they didn't find anything suspicious. So, the police left, but they did open a missing persons case. Just to cover all bases, they called around to a bunch of clinics, hoping maybe Katie really had checked herself in somewhere, but not a single one had seen her. The next morning, police began piecing together a timeline of Katie's disappearance. And naturally, all eyes were on Andy's house, since that's where her car had been found. Detectives learned there was a surveillance camera nearby, so they pulled the footage from the previous couple of days. On April 21st, the day before Katie went missing, she was seen pulling up to Andy's house. The footage showed her getting into his van, kissing him and smiling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the next morning, at 9:20 a.m., things took a very different turn. That was the day Andy told police he'd been at work when Katie supposedly dropped off her car. But the footage said otherwise. It clearly showed Katie arriving at his house, getting out of her car, and climbing into the passenger seat of Andy's van. And right there behind the wheel was Andy himself. Police immediately checked traffic cameras along the direction the van had gone and eventually spotted it again. This time, the van stopped at a McDonald's, then headed out toward the highway. The final footage showed Andy turning onto a rural back road, leading into a wooded area. After that, the van disappeared from view for nearly an hour. But then it popped up again, heading back the way it came. This time, though, there was only one person in the vehicle. So now, a much darker picture was starting to form. Based on the footage, it looked like Andy had driven Katie out to a wooded area and then left without her. After reviewing the surveillance videos, police pulled location data from Katie's phone on the day she went missing. The records showed that her phone disconnected from the tower near her house early that morning, then reconnected near Andy's home. From there, the phone's path followed the exact route the van had taken. But soon enough, things stopped lining up. According to the location data, Katie's phone was still in the van as it headed back towards Andy's place. The problem was, Katie was no longer in the van. And then came the final piece. Investigators checked the time those strange messages were sent to Katie's mom and kids. And by that point, Andy had already returned home alone. But location data clearly showed that those texts were sent from his house. Given that all the evidence directly contradicted Andy's version of events, police decided to head back to his house. And the moment they stepped inside, something fell off. The place was boiling hot. Turns out, Andy had fired up the wood-burning stove, despite the weather being pretty mild outside. Right away, detectives suspected he might have been trying to destroy some evidence. But by the time they got there, all that was left in the stove was ash. Even so, they arrested Andy and brought him in for questioning. Surprisingly, he didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he looked completely relaxed and stuck to his original story, claiming Katie had probably checked herself into a clinic to deal with her anxiety. When detectives started pressing for more answers, he shut down completely and said he wouldn't talk without a lawyer. So once again, they were left with nothing. After the interrogation, police decided to launch a large-scale search operation in the forest where Katie's phone had last pinged, right before Andy was seen driving back alone. But covering that area wasn't an easy task. They were looking at roughly 25 miles of rugged terrain. Still, they pulled in dozens of officers, requested backup from other agencies, and headed out into the woods. Soon, they had helicopters with thermal imaging, drones, specialized equipment, and even a team of divers. Volunteers joined in too, and the search quickly became one of the biggest operations their town had ever seen. But even with all that manpower, it still wasn't enough to cover such a huge area. Then, out of nowhere, police got a tip. Someone had seen Andy's van parked in a specific part of the forest. That changed everything. Now that they had a likely spot, they were able to narrow the search down to a 5-mile radius. As the search teams combed through the forest, detectives brought Andy in for another round of questioning. This time, they laid out the surveillance footage and other evidence they'd gathered. And now, faced with the facts, Andy changed his story. He admitted that he and Katie had driven out to the woods, but what he said next left investigators baffled. According to Andy, the two of them went there to have a picnic. He claimed Katie had a habit of writing down her thoughts in a journal and then burning the pages as a way to let go of things that were bothering her. He insisted that morning had been no different. They had a picnic, lit a small fire, she burned a few pages, and then, according to him, he drove home. As for what happened to Katie after that, he said he had no idea. Of course, detectives didn't buy Andy's story. But the problem was, they still didn't have any solid leads. The search teams had come up empty, and with no trace of Katie in the woods, investigators shifted their focus to her relationship with Andy. According to her family, Katie had met him 3 years earlier. He had 2 kids from a previous marriage, worked in construction, and at first he seemed like a reliable, stable guy. But it didn't take long for her loved ones to notice cracks in the relationship, and he had a habit of trying to control Katie, telling her how to act, how to talk, even how to think. He also constantly brought up her anxiety, using it as a way to dismiss anything she said or did that he didn't like. And over time, that pressure only made her anxiety worse. Eventually, Andy offered to pay for her treatment, and Katie agreed. But as time went on, things just kept getting worse. The fights became more frequent, more intense, and eventually the relationship fell apart. For Katie, breaking up felt like a weight off her shoulders. But for Andy, it was something he just couldn't accept. Not long after they split, Katie discovered someone had slashed the tires on her car. She was certain it was Andy, but she never reported it to the police. A few months before Katie went missing, she got a letter from the court saying she owed Andy £4,000, the amount he'd spent on her treatment. Katie was already struggling to cover basic expenses for her and her kids, and she had no idea how she'd come up with that kind of money. Over time, late fees piled on, and the debt grew to £6,000. The whole situation sent her anxiety through the roof. She was terrified she'd lose her home, and with it, the only stable place her kids had. But more than anything, she was afraid of Andy. In one message to her mom, Katie said she was scared of him and genuinely believed he might hurt her. She even told her sister, "If anything ever happens to me, look at Andy first." Still, just a month before she disappeared, Andy reached out to her. He told her he regretted ever taking her to court. He promised to drop the case and even said he'd pay all the extra fees that had built up since the ruling. Andy apologized for his anger, told her he wanted to change, and eventually, Katie forgave him. Despite everything, they got back together. Still, detectives found something even more disturbing. Just one day after Andy promised to fix everything with the court, he actually called the debt collectors and told them to go harder on Katie. He wanted them to push her even more. Investigators believe this was all part of his plan to increase the pressure on her, making her even more dependent on him. Katie, of course, had no idea this was happening because Andy kept telling her he was working on canceling the whole thing. A few weeks later, he called the debt collectors again, this time claiming that Katie had shown up at his house and attacked him. Once again, he pushed them to go after her for the money as quickly as possible. When they got in touch with Katie, she freaked out. But Andy brushed it off, telling her she was just being dramatic and there was no reason to panic. He said he was still working on getting the court ruling overturned, but that it was complicated and would take time. And then, just like before, he went right back to telling her she needed help, that something was wrong with her. This gave detectives an even darker picture of what they were dealing with. All the evidence pointed to one thing: Andy was a skilled manipulator and a compulsive liar who would do anything to get what he wanted. And soon, detectives got even more confirmation of that theory. People who knew him said the same thing. They told investigators that Andy had a way of getting into people's heads and controlling them, something he'd been doing for years, even with those closest to him. But even with all that, police still had no clue where Katie was. The search dragged on, day after day, with no trace of her. But then, finally, investigators caught a break. A local man came forward with a strange story. He said that the morning after Katie went missing, Andy randomly showed up at his house. They didn't know each other, but Andy walked up to him and asked him a weird question. "Do you know when your bins were last emptied?" That immediately raised red flags. Officers rushed over and found that the trash bins outside hadn't been picked up in several days. They started digging through the garbage, and inside one of the bags, they found something chilling. It was stained with blood, and inside were Katie's sandals. A DNA test confirmed that the blood was hers. At that point, detectives were sure of one thing: Katie was gone, and Andy was officially charged with her murder. But there was still one huge problem. They had no idea where her body was. Soon after Andy was formally charged with murder, he told detectives he wanted to talk. And just like before, he changed his story yet again. This time, Andy said he and Katie had gone out to the woods that morning for a picnic. While they were sitting by the fire, Katie spotted a hatchet he'd used to chop some wood. And, according to him, she jokingly dared him to throw it and try to hit a soda can she was holding a few feet away. Andy said he took her up on it, but as he threw the hatchet, Katie suddenly leaned forward, and it struck her in the back of the head. Of course, detectives didn't believe a word of it, but this time, Andy at least admitted where her body was. He said that when Katie collapsed and died, he panicked. There was no cell surface in that part of the forest, and according to him, he didn't have the strength to carry her back to the van. So instead, he decided to bury her right there to keep animals from getting to her body. He said he dug a shallow grave, placed Katie's body inside, and covered it with leaves and branches. Then he marked the spot by tying a plastic bag to a stick, planning to come back later. According to Andy, his plan was to go home, say goodbye to his kids, settle everything, and then just be gone. He also admitted to burning Katie's phone along with some of her other belongings in his fireplace. After that, he scooped up the charred remains and dumped them in a trash bin somewhere around town. After speaking with Andy, police headed back to his house, hoping to uncover something new. This time, forensic experts did manage to find traces of blood inside his washing machine, which belonged to Katie. Meanwhile, the search for Katie's body continued. Investigators focused on locating the stick with the plastic bag Andy claimed he'd used to mark the burial site. But even with that clue, search teams still couldn't find the exact spot. While the search was still underway, detectives uncovered something else. After digging into Andy's online activity, they found that he'd been talking to a number of women on various dating sites, flirting with pretty much anyone who'd respond. He'd even been seeing at least one woman in person. According to their conversations, Andy had told her he owned multiple properties across the country. They were even talking about moving to Scotland together and buying a house. But that wasn't even the most interesting part. As they kept going through his phone, investigators discovered something that changed everything. Based on GPS data, the day before Katie vanished, Andy had stopped by his parents' house, then turned off his phone for about an hour and a half. During that time, his van was caught on several surveillance cameras, heading straight toward the woods. After talking to Andy's parents, police found out that the morning before Katie went missing, he'd borrowed a shovel. That's when it hit them. Andy had probably gone out to the woods that day to dig her grave ahead of time. The next day, after killing Katie and using her phone to message her kids and family, Andy also texted his other girlfriend using his own phone. He told her something had come up with his kids and that he'd have to cancel their date. But that wasn't all. In the Notes app on his phone, investigators found something even more disturbing. Drafts of the exact same messages he'd sent to Katie's children and mother. Digital forensics showed that he'd been editing those drafts over the course of several weeks, tweaking them repeatedly, trying to match Katie's writing style so no one would suspect a thing. And most telling of all was the fact that the word "while" was misspelled in the exact same way it appeared in the final messages. It's also worth noting that the note had been created over a month before the murder, and that proved one thing beyond all doubt. Andy didn't just snap. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe even longer, carefully laying the groundwork for something he knew he was going to do. When police confronted Andy with the evidence that he'd been in the woods the day before the murder, he claimed he had just gone there to walk his dog, not to dig a grave. Soon, search teams finally found the stick with the plastic bag Andy had mentioned, but there was no grave anywhere nearby. They scoured the area inch by inch, but came up empty. So, detectives made a decision. They brought Andy out to the woods and asked him to show them exactly where he'd buried Katie. Once they got there, Andy pointed to a specific patch of ground, and what shocked everyone was that search teams had already been through that exact spot multiple times, but no one had even considered that a grave could be hidden there. The ground looked completely untouched, flat, smooth, and totally natural. No signs of digging, no shifted soil, nothing out of place. It had been concealed so well. Officers later admitted there was no way they would have ever found it without Andy's help. As soon as the forensic team began digging, they found Katie, right where Andy had said she'd be. But what they uncovered next was something no one expected. Somehow, Andy had managed to bury her beneath a web of tree roots that were growing deep underground. Later, a geology expert explained just how complex that grave actually was. According to him, it would have taken hours to dig something like that. There was no way Andy could have done it in one go, so he'd clearly come back more than once. The expert also pointed out that Andy had separated the soil by layers, then buried them back in the correct order, which is exactly why the grave looked so untouched. That level of planning was chilling. Once Katie's body was recovered, it was handed over to forensic examiners. And right away, Andy's story about the Coke can and the axe throw completely fell apart. Katie had died from blows to the head with a hatchet, but not just one or two. She'd been struck 12 times. By that point, there was no doubt in the detectives' minds. This wasn't an accident. This was cold, calculated, and premeditated murder. With all of that, the prosecution began preparing for trial. The evidence against Andy was overwhelming, more than enough to secure a conviction. But one thing remained unclear: the motive. Investigators believed Andy was fueled by bitterness and resentment. Katie had broken up with him months earlier, and it looked like his ego just couldn't handle the rejection. That bruised pride, they believed, turned into hatred and ultimately led him to kill her. The trial began in November 2022, and at first, Andy pleaded not guilty. But just 3 days in, he suddenly changed course. Out of nowhere, he reversed his plea and admitted to the murder. Unfortunately for Katie's family, he didn't offer any new details, just accepted responsibility. But it was still enough, and in the end, the court sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 32 years, calling him a deeply dangerous individual. And so, the case was officially closed. But the story surrounding Andy still leaves questions. Given that he was dating multiple women at once and constantly pursuing others through dating apps, it's hard to shake the feeling that Katie may not have been the only one. Everything about him pointed to a man who craved control, who seemed to enjoy manipulating and hurting the women around him. And there's every reason to believe that Katie might not have been the first.